Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of people in the hallway and quite a few others who are registered for today but have not arrived yet, and I suspect there'll be people coming in a little bit late, so I apologize if the room gets very crowded later on. And I'll just start with some opening stuff so the people who aren't here aren't going to miss that much. First, for those who don't know me, I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld. I'm the Director of Programs for the National Press Foundation. Very glad to welcome all of you here today, and I want to thank the partners who've helped us put this together. We work with Politico, with the Regional Reporters Association. Who's here from the Regional Reporters? Who here is a member of the Regional Reporters Association? Okay, we have several in the room. Any of you who cover regional issues here in the Capitol, I highly recommend that you join the Regional Reporters Association because they're a great group. They do training, social activities. They set up meetings with folks on the Hill that are very useful. So that's an excellent group. Also the Center on Congress at Indiana University, which has been our partner in this series of Capitol Hill issues briefings for several years now. They do a terrific job. And there's Phil Duncan, who represents the center for us. Say hi, Phil. You'll see on your agenda that later today we're hoping to actually hear from the president and founder of the Center on Congress, former Congressman Lee Hamilton. We're not sure if that's going to happen. You may have heard that Indiana is closed because of weather. So we are holding out a little bit of hope, but maybe not a lot. Also want to thank the Wilson Center, our hosts today. They do a terrific job. We really appreciate their hospitality. We've been meeting here for several years. And mention that this, the David Swit Endowment to the National Press Foundation helps us present a variety of programs through the year that help to clear up some of the mystery around economics, financial, and budgetary issues. So the budget is what we're here to talk about today. I'm really confused about the budget because I feel like over the last couple of years there's just been this sort of roller coaster of things happening, but we haven't really had a budget. Now something happened in December, and I'm looking forward to getting a clearer idea of exactly what that was and what it means going forward. Fortunately, we have, to help explain that to us, Joe Minarik. He is a Senior Vice President and Director of Research for the Committee for Economic Development. And he's got a long history of dealing with the budget on the Hill. He was the Chief Economist at OMB for the 8 years of the Clinton administration. He worked with Senator Bill Bradley on the Tax Reform Act of 1986, a variety of other things. He's been Chief Economist also to the House Budget Committee, 2 stints there, Staff Director at the Joint Economic Committee, and recently served on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force and the National Academy of Sciences, our Fiscal Future Project, which were 2 big national efforts to reduce the federal budget deficit. So Joe Minarik is somebody who totally understands how this budget process works, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. You all should have received in your email the document that we've got projected on the screen now. You can, and we had a couple of extra printed copies. Does anyone need a printed copy? We have a limited number, so we will pass around the few that we have. And if you don't get one, can you just maybe pass them down? Yeah, that'd be terrific. So Joe, okay. Take it away, sir, and sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Joe, you can let them know whether you want them to ask questions as you go or hold them
Sure.
Sure.
Thanks, Linda, for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I think for some of you, probably a few of you have been here before to one of these sessions. Originally started out pretty much going through a kind of a factual basis of eternal verities about the presentation of the budget, but the world has changed enough that one doesn't know from one year to the next whether the eternal verities will hold true. So I've started to throw in a little bit of commentary to try to help think about the situation that we're facing this year and in the last few years. So I'll try to do that to help to warm things up. Probably the reason why I'm here is to convey to you the information that you need. That means your questions are extremely important. I would say if at any moment you have a question, give me a wave. If I get to thinking that I'm not going to get through the material, that'll be my job then to hold you off, but I'm happy to answer questions. Maybe I'll be able to suggest a couple things that you don't know to ask questions about. That might help too. Yes, it's a very, very odd situation in which we find ourselves. Every budget year we've had for the last several has been unique. This one is unique. I'll start with the backstory to give you some help in trying to put this process that you're about to see into some kind of perspective, and then I'll get into and probably try to spend less time than usual on kind of the factual basis of the way the budget is constructed, and give you a chance then to follow up with questions at the end. There is one thing that the budget process, by which we would usually mean the generation of a budget resolution, there's really one thing that a budget resolution has to do, and that is it has to produce a number for the total amount of appropriations that will be put forward in that year. That's the number that we call the 302A allocation. Everything else in the budget resolution is either informational or optional. There can be very important things that a budget resolution does. It can, in a monumental year for action, a budget resolution can create and sanction a reconciliation bill. That's the bill that you think about historically as being important to major changes in the budget. So a reconciliation bill, for example, was passed in 1993 to embody substantial amounts of deficit reduction. The 1993 reconciliation bill, in fact, resulted in the balanced budgets that we had in 1998, 1999, and 2000 and 2001. In 1997, they didn't know they had already balanced the budget, so they passed another reconciliation bill. There was a very important reconciliation bill passed in 1990, which created the budget process as we know it today, although it has fallen into disrepair. There was a reconciliation bill passed in 2001, which was designed to facilitate, to avoid the risk of a filibuster for a piece of legislation that would eliminate the budget surplus that we had at the time, and it sure worked well. Certainly accomplished that. So that is one thing that a budget resolution can do. And in a few years, as I suggested, we've had big deal budget action, and that almost inevitably involves a reconciliation bill. Budget resolutions can include reserve funds that allow the Congress to undertake certain initiatives. There is a lot of information in a budget resolution articulating economic assumptions, providing estimates of budget outcomes for the next 10 years under a baseline of assumptions and so forth. But all that is really window dressing. The one thing that you absolutely have to have is you have to have a number for the maximum amount of appropriations in total. Budget resolution also includes what are called 302B allocations, which are allocations of funds for individual appropriation subcommittees. Those numbers are meaningless, because the appropriations committees take the 302A allocation and subdivide it themselves for their subcommittees. So the number that matters coming out of the budget resolution really is the 302A allocation. And for the last number of years, I think it's 3 or 4 at this point, but I can't tell you for sure. We have not had a budget resolution, and so we have not had a 302A number to begin the year. And that makes life very difficult for the appropriations process, particularly in the Senate. It is easy in the House to tack a House allocation, a House 302A number into a piece of legislation that's going to become law, and that can happen in the Senate with the risk of filibuster. That is much more difficult to do. Last few years, we haven't had a 302A number. The achievement of the budget deal that we had put into law back in December was the determination of 302A numbers not only for the current ongoing fiscal year, which is 2014, but also for the next fiscal year, 2015, which begins on October 1 of this year. So that roadblock to the appropriations process has been moved out of the way for the next 2 years. People can argue about why it was that the Congress actually managed to settle this issue this year. For some people, the point will be that the Republican majority in the House came to the conclusion that they were in a good political place, and so what they wanted to do was to make legislation through the beginning of the next fiscal year as uneventful as possible so that they could pursue their own political agenda without interruption and without distraction from possible hiccups in the appropriations process. That's one possible agreement, one possible interpretation, but in any event, that's where we are. So we are coming up upon a January 15th expiration of the current continuing resolution for keeping the government agencies open. And by that time, the Congress will need to take action to continue funding for the various federal agencies through the appropriations process. Now, they could do that by completing an actual continuing resolution or omnibus appropriations bill for the rest of the year. I haven't seen any indication that they're ready to do something quite as large scale by then. It is possible that instead what they will wind up doing is passing another temporary continuing resolution to give themselves some more time. The one part of this process that does appear to be optimistic in terms of the completion of the appropriations is that it does seem as though the two heads of the budget deal that passed last month, who were the budget chairs, Patty Murray in the Senate, Paul Ryan in the House, do appear to have had at least some conversations with the appropriators, Barbara Mikulski in the Senate, Hal Rogers in the House, to have some agreement over what the numbers for appropriations ought to be. Now, what that means is that the appropriators apparently had some input on what these 302A numbers were going to be. So they're at least expressing some optimism that they can write bills according to those numbers. I would warn that you don't know if you can write a bill that will pass the House and the Senate for example, the 2014 final appropriations numbers until it actually happens. There has been a lot of difficulty getting legislation through the House, as you know. The Speaker has sometimes misread the temperature of the House and has put legislation on the floor or gotten ready to put it on the floor and found that he was not able to deliver on completing that legislation. So this particular episode. It's possible that we could have the same kind of a problem again. However, at this point, the indications do appear to be relatively optimistic that we are going to get appropriations passed at some point for the remainder of the fiscal year, and quite possibly without a further government shutdown. So we'll see. Obviously, we're getting right up about to that date, about to that January 15th deadline, and we'll see what transpires from there. But the reason why we are gathered here together is to discuss the President's budget, and this raises this current process and all of its interruptions makes it more difficult for the President to produce a budget. Certainly no worse than it was last year, but there are issues. So, for example, if you think about the way the process is supposed to work, and the way the last time it actually worked on schedule was calendar year 1994 for fiscal year 1995. What is supposed to happen is that appropriations bills for all of the federal government agencies are supposed to be completed before the beginning of the fiscal year. So September 30th at the latest. Then the President has a long and cushy period from September 30th until the first Monday in February to produce a budget, which includes his proposed numbers for appropriations for the next fiscal year, which will begin the following October 1. So back in the old days, the anticipation was when you were at OMB, you would have actual appropriations numbers to put in your book, and you could propose changes to those numbers with a knowledge of where the foundation was when you were building the first floor. Now here we are, and the President's supposed to build the first and second and third stories of the building, and the foundation isn't there yet. So one possibility as we look forward is that we could quite possibly see the President doing again this year what he did last year, which was to delay the release of the budget. I have to say last year I was quite surprised to see the budget introduction delayed. It was a first in modern memory, with the exception of years of unfriendly takeovers in the White House. So, for example, in calendar year 1993, President Clinton took over from President George Bush the Elder. The budget was the responsibility of President Clinton. The due date was the first Monday in February. In 1993, just to show you that Murphy is alive and well, the first Monday in February was February the 1st. So President Clinton put his hand on the Bible on January 20th, and he was supposed to produce a budget 12 days later. Well, you can't do that. So in years when party control of the presidency has changed hands, the budget is inevitably late. However, in other years, we have been on time up until last year. And last year, the President sent the Congress a letter and said, you know, terribly sorry. I know the law tells me that I'm supposed to produce a budget early in February. I'm not going to do it. So as you know, the President, his Chief of Staff, and all senior members of the White House staff went to budget jail. Sorry that there is no budget jail, we've discovered over the years. But one might surmise that this year there would be more of a reason even than last year for the President to postpone the release of his budget. It could enable him to wait until we have the final appropriations numbers for fiscal year 2014, and he could come up with a budget that would have real numbers in it for appropriations. One of the reasons to consider that, and I am making this suggestion on no factual basis. This is me talking. I've not talked to anybody in the White House I have no source. But looking back at the last couple of budgets, the president has put forward, apart from the appropriations part of the budget, a very robust, very aggressive legislative program. He included significant investments in program changes, some of which included appropriations proposals, for example, with respect to transportation. He included significant reductions in several important entitlement programs, including Medicare and Medicaid. He included significant tax increases for upper income individuals. You put the whole thing together and you wound up with significant amounts of deficit reduction. So the president was actually pretty gutsy in terms of the program he put forward the last couple of years, at least in terms of the numerical outcomes, the bottom lines in the budget. Those on the other side of the aisle would not use the term gutsy to describe the president's program. They'd say his proposals with respect to particularly health care were relatively lame. They would like to see significant changes in the way Medicare and Medicaid operate. But at least in terms of the overall numbers, the president was proposing pretty big changes in the budget. Yeah.
Okay, we're wildly popular here, and so we actually are going to need to use those seats against that wall. So if everyone could just stop for a second. Let folks who want to sit. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, good.
There's one here too. Bill,
Yes.
can you get somebody to hang this up?
You bet. I can do coats. I do coats.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
So if you give me the right odds, I'm willing to place a bet that the budget this year will be late. We'll see whether that turns out to be an accurate prediction of where we're going. As I suggested, if you told me 2 years ago that a president was going to be late submitting a budget, I would have been shocked, but we've knocked that precedent down. So I'll be interested to see whether the budget this year is on time or not. There is one dangling issue this year that was not resolved by the budget deal that was enacted back in December. That deal did resolve, as I said, the appropriations number, the 302A allocation for this year and next year. However, it was silent on the topic of the debt limit. And as some of you may recall, the most recent legislation prior suspended the debt limit through February 7th, so about a month from now. The suspension of the debt limit is a new trick. The idea is that the Treasury Secretary is allowed to issue new debt. The debt limit is not in force. There are some restrictions in terms of what the Treasury Secretary can do. He cannot borrow a lot of money and pile up cash, for example. But as of February 7th, Treasury Secretary has been operating according to normal procedures. And then on February the 7th, the debt limit becomes the amount of debt that the Treasury has incurred as of that date. So the Secretary is on the debt limit, and He then has to start to resort to what in fancy language is his statutory authorities. Those are sometimes referred to as tricks in the vernacular, to find additional ways to raise cash so that the federal government can pay its bills. There will be a period of time after that date when the Secretary will be able to raise money and will be able to keep the Treasury Department current. However, at some point after February the 7th, and it's unpredictable exactly how long that's going to last. It depends on a lot of things that are imponderable, and particularly in the beginning of a calendar year, there are a lot of tax issues that are highly uncertain. But at some point after February 7th, you will start seeing letters coming up to the Congress from the Treasury Secretary saying, I'm running out of the ability to raise cash. As of a certain date, I'm not going to be able to pay my bills. By the way, they're your bills. And if you want to keep the federal government honest with respect to its creditors, which would probably be a good thing in the long run, you need to increase the debt limit and give me authority to borrow. And there will be all of the language that you have come to expect in a letter like that from the Secretary of the Treasury. He will explain that all he wants to do is pay bills for existing commitments of the federal government. He's not asking to make new commitments. This is a question of whether you're going to pay the cost of the restaurant dinner that you've just eaten. It's not the question of whether you're going to go out. And as a result, being fiscally responsible means increasing the debt limit and allowing the Secretary to pay those bills. One thing that to some of us has been somewhat troubling, and I don't want to be dreadfully partisan about it, but Congressman Ryan, Chairman Ryan of the House Budget Committee, has talked about what his side is going to demand to get an increase in the debt limit. I can honestly say that, at least for myself personally, I've been very straightforward for a long period of time. The debt limit should not be a political bargaining chip. I don't care who's in the White House. I don't care which party controls the Congress. One of the things that we leave to succeeding generations is the clean reputation of the United States of America. And playing with that reputation is extraordinarily dangerous with respect to our ability to maintain prosperity in the long term. So that is the one part of this picture, the debt limit, which was not dealt with in the budget deal that passed the Congress back in December. There's at least some indication that it may become a political football, and that is a matter of some concern. I did, in the handout, show you some pictures, and I'll have to see whether I can manage to put them up on the screen in a legible way. Why are we doing that? Oh, okay. No, that's not what I want to do. Here we go.
Are you trying to just advance through the document?
Yeah, I'm just trying. There we go. Got it. And, of course, they're sideways. But you've got the paper in front of you. So why don't we just, I'll just refer you to the charts there.
Yeah, for people who don't have it, please look for someone around you who's got it. We passed them out earlier.
Got a picture here, the intent of which is to show you how rapidly the federal government's financial status has deteriorated. That's wonderful. Thank you, Linda. And this looks a lot better in color. The curve on the right has a label showing you that it's the outlook for the public debt as of December 2007, which is, of course, just before the financial crisis crashed down in all its glory. And then the curve on the left, where you have an arrow pointing to the debt, the level of the debt for 2010, shows you what actually happened. The horizontal line between those two curves shows you approximately 60%, the level at approximately 60% of GDP. Footnote, why do economists always talk about the public debt as a percentage of the GDP? If you were to think about it's essentially scaling the amount of the debt to the income flow out of which that debt has to be serviced. If I were to ask you a question, I know I have a friend who has a $400,000 mortgage. Is that a problem? The first question you have to ask is, well, I don't know if it's a problem or not. What's that person's income? And if the $400,000 mortgage is owed by the senior vice president of a major U.S. corporation who makes $4 million a year, $400,000 is walking around money. If it is that person's secretary who is grossly underpaid at $40,000 a year, that $400,000 mortgage is a major problem. So you don't know whether the amount of debt is an issue or not until you know the flow of income out of which the particular person or entity has to service that debt. So we look at the public debt, the debt of the United States of America, out of the flow of income that we have at our disposal to service that debt. And that flow of income is, to an order of magnitude, the amount of the gross domestic product, which is the sum and total of the goods and services that are produced within the United States. So the 60% level is the limit that was specified, for example, in the Maastricht Treaty. If you want to join the European Monetary Union and use the euro as your currency, you have to pledge, or until recently you did have to pledge, that you would maintain your public debt at less than 60% of your GDP. These days, if the European Monetary Union were to enforce that limit, there would be no nations in the European Monetary Union. Things have gotten a little dicey. But nonetheless, historically, that has been thought to be a reasonable prudential limit for a nation. It's arbitrary. People will argue with it one way or another, but using it as a frame of reference, go back to December 2007. We saw the prospect of the public debt of the United States rising very rapidly in future years. That's largely because of demographically and healthcare-driven costs to the federal government. The anticipation as of December 2007 was that the debt was going to hit 60% of our GDP in 2022. Instead, the financial crisis struck and we hit 60% of our GDP in 2010. So that problem became much more urgent than it was before, and you can see the path that we've been following, but the debt remains substantial enough that its accumulation does continue to become to be a source of concern going forward. Now, extended this chart back to that chart goes back to the end of World War II. 1946 was the year in which the United States public debt was at its highest level relative to our gross domestic product, approximately 110% 6% of GDP is my recollection. That number changes every 5 years. The reason why it changes is not that the debt changes, because that debt number is a datum and is fixed for all time. However, every 5 years, the Department of Commerce revises the gross domestic product. So every 5 years, you have to redraw that chart, and all of those historical numbers change. But at the end of World War II, the ratio of our debt to our GDP was approximately 106%, and we're now talking about going back there at some time in the not too distant future. I would, if you'll pardon me a brief diversion, you will sometimes hear people say that the level of debt that we have today is not a matter of concern. At the end of World War II, U.S. debt was slightly higher than 100% of our GDP. We grew out of it then. We can grow out of it now. So what are you worried about? Let's party. The problem with that assertion is that circumstances at the end of World War II were totally different than they are today, and I do mean totally different. Just to give you a couple of examples. At the end of World War II, the federal government was spending approximately 35% of the United States GDP every year on defense. Just defense, not anything else. So the cost of the war effort consumed more than 1/3 of U.S. production, which was run through the federal budget. Within a couple of years after the end of World War II, defense spending fell from 35% of GDP to 5% of GDP. So federal spending could be cut by 30% of GDP in the space of just 2 years with the demobilization at the end of World War II. Defense spending right now is approximately 5% of GDP, and you can't cut 5% of GDP spending on defense by 30% of GDP. So we had at the end of World War II an opportunity to reduce the federal budget deficit, the annual deficit, substantially that we do not have today. At the end of World War II, U.S. households had extraordinarily strong personal balance sheets. The reason was that during World War II, coming out of the Great Depression as they were, U.S. households were making more money than they ever imagined they possibly could. Unemployment, of course, back in the 1930s was as high as 25%. Even going into World War II, it was still in the high teens. All of a sudden, with the onset of the war effort, everybody had a job, either in the service or in war production or supporting war production, at least indirectly. So everybody was making substantial amounts of money, much more than they had thought they ever would, with the proviso that for all the money they were making, they couldn't spend it. And the reason why they couldn't spend it was because strategic materials were, of course, rationed for purposes of the war effort. One of those strategic materials was gasoline. You couldn't buy gasoline without ration tickets. And for many people, that meant very limited amounts, just enough to get to and from work. You couldn't buy a house because all the residential and other types of construction that were ongoing were in the service of the war effort. You couldn't buy a car. Automobiles were not generally available. All of that effort was going into building jeeps and tanks and aircraft and ships. So over the course of World War II, people saved an enormous amount of money, not because they necessarily wanted to, but because they had no choice. There was nothing to buy. And in the course of saving all that money, they helped to finance that run-up in the federal government's debt. At the end of World War II, the end of rationing, the troops came home and went into all of those factories that used to be making jeeps and aircraft and ships, and instead started making automobiles and refrigerators. People could buy gasoline, people went out and bought cars. Instead of building industrial and military structures, the construction workers went into the private sector and started building homes. And you had an enormous confluence of not only the opportunity, but importantly, the wherewithal to engage in substantial amounts of consumption. And as a result of that, the U.S. economy grew very rapidly. Contrast that with where we are today. Household balance sheets are not flush. They are, in fact, pretty much on the floor, not inconsequentially because of the number of marginal or underwater mortgages with the fall in housing values. Instead of having the troops coming home to populate the factories, we have the baby boomers retiring and slowing the rate of growth of the labor force. The whole situation is totally opposite to what it was at the end of World War II. So I would just want to emphasize that the situation that we are facing now with the rising public debt is totally different from what we had at the end of World War II. The circumstances that we will have to deal with going forward if we do not, at some point in the not too distant future, begin to turn our budgetary situation around, will be far more dangerous than was the time at the end of World War II, even with a debt level that was slightly higher than what we have today. Sure.
What has this steep increase in the debt as a share of the GDP, what effect has that had on the federal outlays, or will it have on federal outlays going forward?
The most important issue is the cost of servicing the debt. And lo and behold, that's the next topic of the next slide. Wanted to point out to you that the public debt is substantially short-term in its maturity structure. If you look at this chart, it divides outstanding Treasury securities by the number of years until they mature. And what you see there is that very slightly less than 1/3 of outstanding Treasury securities mature in 1 year or less. More than 1/3 mature between 1 and 5 years from now. And only about 1/4 of outstanding Treasury securities have maturity dates more than 5 years out into the future. And now this refers not only to the maturity of each individual security, but also how long those securities have been outstanding. So a 30-year bond that was issued 29 years ago is in the 1 year or less category. The important point here is what happens if interest rates begin to rise. And as you know, interest rates right now, this chart goes back to 1980. Interest rates right now are essentially on the floor by historical standards. The interest rate on a 3-month Treasury bill on an annualized basis is somewhere south of 1/4%. The reason why interest rates are so low is because the economy is so weak. Demand for credit is very low. As a result of that, the Federal Reserve has been trying to keep interest rates even lower to try to facilitate consumer purchases of durable goods that are financed with credit, and to try to facilitate business investment. We anticipate that at some date in the future, the economy is going to begin to recover. When it does begin to recover more strongly, interest rates are going to rise. And if you look at this chart, which covers more than the last 30 years, and if somebody asked you, pick out an interest rate for 3-month Treasury bills for a period of a relatively strong economy with limited inflation, you'd look at this chart and you'd say, well, a fair to middling number for 3-month Treasury bills would be about 4% annualized yield. So do the math. Right now, the 3-month Treasury bill rate is, let's say, for sake of making the math a little simpler, 0.25% per year annual yield. We expect that when the economy recovers, the interest rate on 3-month Treasury bills is going to go up to about 4% annual yield. The cost of servicing each and every Treasury bill will increase by a factor of 16. The same thing is true with just a slightly different relationship with respect to 10-year Treasury notes. Right now, 10-year notes are going at about 2%. In the long term, you expect the 10-year Treasury rate in good times to be about 5%. So you're talking about interest rates on Treasury notes to increase by a factor of about 2.5. So you have all that outstanding debt, which we are piling up from 1 month to the next as the federal government continues to run large budget deficits. Interest rates right now are very low. It's a little bit like a household borrowing at teaser rates on a credit card. Interest rates are low for a while, and then at some point they are going to snap up. When they do, the cost of servicing the public debt will increase substantially. And just to give a sense of magnitude, the anticipation the last time, this is CBO's numbers, the cost of debt service back in 2010 was almost exactly $200 billion. This chart starts in 2011. And you can see that when you get out to 10 years from now, the cost of servicing the debt will be starting to press $1 trillion, or in other words, about 5 times what it was back in 2010. And it's worth noting that this increase in the cost of servicing the debt is calculated on the assumption that interest rates remain at historical norms. So the 3-month Treasury bill goes up to 4%, which is about where it was in the 1990s when the economy was growing healthily, but inflation was quite low. Likewise for the 10-year T-note, up to about 5%. In other words, the federal government is running very large budget deficits. Its debt is piling up and growing faster than the economy is growing. And our creditors, in these assumptions, remain perfectly calm and are not the least bit worried about prospects for future debt service or redemption of securities, even under those adverse circumstances, and so interest rates remain low. If interest rates were to rise more rapidly, the cost of debt service would rise even more rapidly. Yeah.
When is it built in here that the rates will go up and how quickly? And the other thing is, as the rates go up, I guess you're suggesting that that would come as the economy is stronger. Obviously, revenues will go up with the stronger economy. Is there any way to get a sense of how fast this will outpace the, I mean, if it's tied to a better economy, it also means our capacity to pay them.
Yeah. You can see here that the path for 10-year treasuries is expected to start rising, probably sometime in 2014, rising relatively slowly. Increases in federal revenues are built into the projections that give you the increases in debt, which interact with the increases in interest rates, which give you the cost of debt service. Budget projections are always a little shaky around turning points in the economy. What is normally the way that the budget models work is that they work off of changes in identifiable economic indicators. So reductions in unemployment, increases in output. What happens when the economy begins to turn, particularly in recent years, and this was true even back in the 1990s, financial markets begin to improve, and the financial markets generate substantial increases in personal incomes. As a result, we have had somewhat greater increases in tax revenues in the last year or so than you would have anticipated. And the same, as I say, was true back in the 1990s. One of the things that happened in 1995 and 1996 was that with the beginning of an acceleration in economic growth came substantial movements in financial markets, and every year when the tax returns came in, we were surprised by how much money was there. And that helped to improve the budget. It was certainly an important part of the movement of the budget very rapidly from substantial budget deficits into budget surpluses in the late 1990s. So all of that is factored in to the budget outlook. The question about that kind of a turning point, such as the improvement in the budget that we've had over the last 12 months or so, is that it is essentially a one-time phenomenon. You have, for a period of time, revenues outpacing forecasts, but they cannot continue to surprise forever. The level of revenues may stay relatively high, but the rate of growth of revenues will tail off after a period of time. And so the initial knee-jerk reaction on the part of many folks who are watching the budget situation from 2 or 3 degrees of remove is to say, look, the budget problem is solving itself. We have nothing to worry about. Let's party. The difficulty is that those surprises at some point are going to stop. And in contrast to past episodes, we already have accumulated a very much worrisome level of debt. So the level of debt, for example, today we're in the 70 to 75% of GDP range. In the early 1990s, we were worried because we were at 50. Because the level of debt is higher, when interest rates rise, you've got more leverage from the interest rates on the level of debt. That means the cost of debt service goes up. Debt service breeds deficits, breeds debt service. You can get to the point where I think it was Einstein who made reference to the power of compound interest, being the greatest force known to man. Well, that can work for you or it can work against you. We're in a circumstance now where there is every danger that we will find that compound interest is our enemy and not our friend. So you let this process get out of hand, and that's what the result is going to be. You've all also heard, and this chart did not turn out too well given I could not convince this guy to print in color, but you can see from the legends there what's going on. Since March 2001, an approximate date which I chose totally at random, the amount of new issues of Treasury securities, and this is Treasury issues outside of the federal government and not including the Federal Reserve. So private investors who have bought Treasury securities to provide the federal government with cash to finance its operations. Private investors have purchased $2 of every 3 of new Treasury issues over the last dozen years. Foreign investors are inherently less reliable than domestic investors for raising cash for the federal government, if only because if you are a non-U.S. investor who is thinking of purchasing Treasury securities, you have to go through 2 transactions to buy the Treasury security. First, you have to convert your home currency into dollars, and then you have to take those dollars and buy the Treasury security. And what that means is that over a period of time, there are 2 reasons why you might decide to sell your Treasury security, not just one. One would be if you believe that the value of the Treasury security is going to decline. The other would be if you believe that the value of the dollar is going to decline. Now, usually you would expect those 2 things to happen together, but the point here is that you have to be concerned about the possibility that foreign investors are going to decide that they are less interested in owning Treasury securities, and you don't need a conspiracy story to worry you about this circumstance. It's not a question of foreign investors deciding that they want to sink the U.S. economy, so they're going to dump their Treasury securities. All you need is foreign investors to decide, I've got all the Treasury securities and U.S. dollar-denominated securities that I need. I just don't need to buy any more. And if there is that kind of a change in investor sentiment, then at the next auction, whereas at the present time, foreign investors are buying 2 out of every $3 of U.S. Treasury securities. If foreign investors don't show up, you're going to then have the former purchasers of $1 out of every 3 are going to have to take the entire auction. And that means that interest rates rise, and if interest rates rise even more rapidly than we were talking about happening just with a normal economic recovery, you could have an even more rapid increase in the cost of debt service to the federal government.
But what does the federal budget look like if you have to spend a quarter or a third of your revenue on debt service?
Looks pretty ugly. You know, we are now with very low interest rates. Debt service costs, I believe, are in the 5 to 10% range. If you go back to the early 1990s, debt service costs were 15% of the federal budget. We are talking about going back to that 15% level and continuing to rise within the next 10 years.
But the chart you showed, you're looking at $800 billion a year possibly in debt service. I mean, how is that even a realistic projection at this point then?
Realistic in the sense of being not too high or not too low. You have a curve that is rising. At some point, it is going to hit 800, 900, $1 trillion. Mm-hmm. There's no question about that. The question is how fast and what the trajectory is going to be.
I'm trying to get a sense of, I mean, you painted a pretty grim, picture here about the state of our finances right now. So what does this mean in terms of real-life implications for what happens with, mandatory spending will we have any money for discretionary spending? I mean, like, what is the scenario we're looking at here going forward?
Okay, I did not include charts about very long-term projections of the federal budget. This is actually the end of this part of the story. But if I had a chart that I typically carry around with me and is now on the thumb drive that's connected to my computer back in the office, you would see that by the time you got into the late 2030s, early 2040s, the cost of debt service and the cost of mandatory programs would equal projected revenues. So discretionary spending would be crowded out of the budget entirely. So at some point in the not too distant future, adjustment to these changes in the numbers is essentially inevitable. Now, the long-term problem in the budget, as I'm sure you've all heard many times, is healthcare. Projections of healthcare costs are, of course, extremely problematic. One doesn't know whether increases in costs are going to continue to rise at recent historical rates. In the last few years, we have had a modest slowdown in the rate of growth of healthcare costs, defined as the cost of healthcare spending per beneficiary. So in other words, the cost of servicing each individual. So the reason why we have very rapidly growing healthcare costs in the future of the federal budget is, number one, we have rapid growth of healthcare costs per beneficiary. Secondly, we have a substantial increase in the number of beneficiaries as the baby boom generation begins to retire. And that process began back in, for purposes of health care, began in 2011. The senior class of the baby boom was born in 1946. Eligibility for Medicare is age 65. 1946 plus 65 is 2011. For Social Security purposes, the earliest retirement on reduced benefits is at age 62. 1946 plus 62 is 2008. So you began to see the effect on Social Security spending in 2008. You began to see the effect on Medicare in 2011. Now, of course, the youngest retirees are the cheapest from the point of view of Medicare, because generally healthcare problems are correlated with age. If you haven't noticed, I have. So there's that problem over a period of time. In the background of all of this, there are increases in longevity. So people are, on average, living to older ages. The size, while we've been talking about the onset of the problem of the retirement of the baby boom, we have had an increase, a continuous increase in the population that is 85 years old and older, so what we sometimes refer to as the old. And that has been increasing healthcare costs as well. So those factors are compounding one another as you look at the budget projections going forward. Over a period of time, you're going to see substantial increases not only in the cost of Social Security, but also the cost of Medicare and then Medicaid, which provides long-term care to the indigent elderly. And those things are going to compound each other going forward. So, yeah, it's a mess.
I had a question that, I'm sorry, jumps backwards a little bit to something that you started with. Just been thinking about where you said that in the process in Congress, they pass a budget resolution, gives you a top-line spending number, and then the appropriators fill in the details, my understanding. In this last budget deal, though, obviously there were controversial elements, the big one being this cut to military pensions, and I'm not under the impression that appropriators have any control over that. So what do appropriators get to change or adjust, and what is out of their hands, and why can't they make that change?
military retirement is a mandatory program. The Murray-Ryan duet, or pas de deux, or whatever you want to call it, had a relatively broad range of authority, although that authority was relatively thin. The point of what they were trying to do was to deal with the restrictions on discretionary spending, particularly for this year and next year. And the mission that they were given was that any relief that they were going to provide for discretionary spending in 2014 and 2015, they had to offset with agreements for changes in mandatory programs, but that could be over the next 10 years. So they dealt with issues like military retirement, particularly contributions by younger military, current active military. Those decisions were included in that December legislation.
Basically, because that's mandatory, the appropriators they can't touch it.
Appropriators have no authority over those programs. You will hear, on several fronts, that's probably the leading item, but you will hear argument going through the next few months about why those decisions ought to be reversed. Now, there's nothing that requires, there's no cosmic rule that could have prevented a decision by the congressional leadership to provide relief from the sequester, increasing discretionary spending in 2014 and 2015 without offsetting it with mandatory programs. It was just that was the agreement, that was the constraint that that was put on those negotiations. So the appropriators themselves will not have anything to say about that process, but you will certainly hear those issues being discussed. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
Back on the president's budget request, do you have a good rule of thumb of which parts of his request Congress is just going to ignore, and which parts can you look at and say that's probably going to come out pretty, there's like minor details in the budget that the Congress just says, okay, we just let the administration do that, but this other stuff is what they fight over?
Rule of thumb, well, you will hear people say, Dave Obey was, this was part of his mantra when he was talking about appropriations in the Congress. Dave Obey was a senior member of the House delegation, Democrat from Wisconsin, rose through the appropriations membership to become chairman, and I think he sat for maybe 2 or 4 years as chair before he retired from the Congress a few years ago. And he would always say the president's budget is enacted, 96% of the president's budget is enacted every year. If you want to make that claim, and you can make that claim in a fashion such that it is true, the Department of Defense wants bullets. The president's request will include funding for the Department of Defense to buy bullets. So you take that, okay, check. President's budget is enacted. Personnel. President's budget specifies that there will be a certain amount of money for salaries and expenses for standing Army, Air Force personnel, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard. That number will turn out to be approximately correct, approximately what the Congress enacts. So check. You go through the budget with those sorts of things, fuel for the Coast Guard, air traffic controllers in the towers, check. You'll account for a lot of appropriations. you probably would come to the conclusion that those numbers are not tremendously interesting. You know, surprise, you know, Department of Defense buys bullets for soldiers. Where you will see significant differences of opinion will be things like, what the heck are we going to do about funding transportation, highway, construction and maintenance, given that cars now get much greater mileage, and so therefore we're not buying as much gasoline, and therefore fuel tax revenues are falling short of what we had anticipated we were going to spend through the highway program. The president comes up with a very different vision of what you're going to do about that. Nothing happens. So the Congress comes up with a one-year patch. So that's a part of the budget where the president had an opinion about what you ought to do, and things didn't happen. If you go back, now that's talking about the discretionary part of the budget, and the president has an initiative for preschool education. Nothing happens on that. If you want to say, you know, what percentage of the budget that the president proposed did he get? The preschool initiative costs this much. The budget for military personnel and bullets is this much. So you can say the president got 96% of what he asked for, but the 96% that he got is pretty routine, and the things that he considers to be transformational were not a part of that. So that's the discretionary side. Now you go to the mandatory side. The president has a long list of proposals for Medicare, significant changes in tax policy. You know, nothing happens with them. If you were to take those numbers and stack them up against the appropriations numbers, the 96% that the president, or 98% or 99%, whatever number you want to choose, becomes substantially smaller, because there you're talking about real money. So it really does depend on exactly how you formulate the question. But particularly as we are looking at the kinds of things that the president is talking about with changes in mandatory programs, big changes in investment spending, what he would call investment spending for pre-K, big changes in education policy at other levels. You know, those kinds of changes of direction, as opposed to just raw numbers, do not tend to move nearly as much. And if a president gets something like a pre-K initiative, that's a Joe Biden would call it a big something deal. I'll just call it a big deal, because I'm not the vice president. I can't get away with that. Yeah.
Hi, I had a question about when you were talking about the 302A and the 302Bs. You said that the Bs contained in the budget resolution, I think, were useless. But then I know that the Appropriations Committee also votes and approves their own 302Bs, and then they are binding now on the subcommittees,
Yes.
right?
Yes, it's
Okay.
the Appropriations Committee's 302Bs matter.
Okay.
Uh,
Those are the
The
only
budget
ones I know.
resolution 302Bs, you know, you can take that sheet of paper and recycle it. Won't make any difference. But the Appropriations Committee's 302Bs are tremendously important. They are binding on the floor. Now, of course, some bill, as a result of changes in the legislative process, comes in under its 302B, and you got money on the floor, and people dive for it, and they take it and they put it in other bills, because by the time you're done, if you've complied with the 302A number, if the 302Bs don't match up committee to committee because of floor action, that's fair game. That's the way the game is played.
Does that happen a lot? That a subcommittee bill, their bill will be under the request, under their 302B?
Yeah, there are, amendments do happen on the floor. And sometimes those amendments will be actual changes in the amounts of money that are available, and something comes up that somebody doesn't like, and he comes up with an amendment to strike it, and a particular provision of an appropriations bill is struck, and in the course of the action on that bill, that money might not get soaked up, and then you get on to the next bill, and there's some money lying around, and people will try to find ways to get their 302B increase to take up the leftover money. So, yeah, but for purposes of the process, starting from the first day, the Appropriations Committee's 302Bs are important. They are immovable objects.
January 15th, since we have a top-line number, does that mean we will not see another continuing resolution?
That depends on whether the Congress is able to come up with a final bill or bills by January 15th. You will recall that the appropriators told the Ryan Murray School of Dance that they should finish by, I think it was December 2nd or 3rd. And they wound up finishing, you know, essentially when the gavel came down to go into recess. So the appropriators did not have as much time in December before the Congress went home to get started with the process of trying to work out a bill. Now, I don't know quite what they were doing over the holidays. You know, there's no substitute for being there. I'm sure the staff had their holidays ruined and they were trying to work out an agreement, but you know, staff can only go so far. So, you know, here we are, it's the 6th. The deadline is the 15th. Are they going to have a bill by the 15th? I don't know, they might. If they don't, there seems to be enough good feeling at this point that you would expect that there would be another continuing resolution to buy a little bit more time so that they could work and get finished. The smart money at this point is probably that without another shutdown, the appropriations for fiscal year 2014 will be completed. I can't guarantee that. I can't swear to that, but that seems to be where the tendency is at this point. So, you know, in terms of whether they will finish by the 15th, we'll see. Yeah.
The veterans issue, so if appropriations can't touch that, it really comes back to the main budget negotiators to make a change, is that correct? And then another thing on the debt ceiling, can you mention a couple of Ryan's asks in order to address the debt ceiling? You mentioned that he's got a list of some things that he'd want to put on the table to make that happen.
No, I don't have his list.
Okay.
Okay, so this is answering the second question first. What does the House Republican caucus want in exchange for increasing the debt limit? I don't know. They have things that have been mentioned extend from sea to shining sea. You could go as far as in the not too distant past, they demanded a vote on a constitutional amendment to require a balanced budget. Others have suggested provisions with respect to gay marriage or abortion. One of the things that is so scary about the fuss that we are having over the debt limit and that we have had the last couple of rounds is that this is totally without bounds. Demands that could be put forward to increase the debt limit are limitless. And you could have just about anybody in the Congress who could manage to get a few friends together. Actually, you don't even have to be friends. I mean, you could have, you could have one group, a one-issue group on some social issue, collaborating with another group that is doctrinaire on fiscal matters, with another group who are concerned about United States policy with respect to Afghanistan. And if they all agree that they are willing to take the debt limit, to take the U.S. economy and the world economy hostage unless they get what they want, and if taken together they have enough adherence so that they can stop legislation from moving, particularly in the Senate, which means if you can get 41, you can stop the train. You have the opportunity to do essentially unrestricted mischief. So that's what's scary about it. The possibilities, as I say, are essentially endless. And one of the things, by the news accounts, one of the things that has made it difficult for the House Republican caucus to focus is that when they have gotten together and this topic has come up, the list of potential demands has been extremely long and extremely diverse. And as I say, many of the things that wind up on the list are not budget matters at all. And so now that I've held forth on your second question, I forget what your first question was.
The veterans issue.
Yes.
And how likely that might be to change appropriations.
I think that at this point, the mandatory offsets for the increases in the 302A allocations have risen above the level of the budget negotiators to the pay grade of the leadership in the Congress. If you want to attack those, you're dealing with John Boehner and Harry Reid. I'm sure that you could talk to Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, and they would, depending upon who you are, they would probably be very happy to listen to you. But at bottom, I think we're up to the leadership level now. This is, once you get something put into law, you're there. Yeah.
Just to follow up on the December 2-year budget deal, I just want to make sure I have the timeline down correctly. So January 15th, ideally, if appropriators came through with a broad budget bill, that would just be for the next fiscal year, but
The current fiscal year, actually.
the current fiscal year. So the top line number that we have for the following fiscal year, what would be the process to tackle the appropriations for that?
We would then be down into, once they get finished with fiscal year 2014, they then are on to what they normally should be doing at this time of year, which is appropriations for 2015. Now, the way the calendar works, the budget resolution is due by law on April 15th. So the budget resolution should include 302A numbers for fiscal year 2015. If the budget resolution is not completed by by April 15th, you then would get to May 15th, and normally under May 15th, the appropriators could begin to write their appropriations bills. They are freed of waiting for the Budget Committee if the Budget Committee is 1 month late. That's the normal. Now, this year, they already have their 302A. So, in theory, the only thing that's stopping them right now from writing appropriations for 2015 is that they haven't written their appropriations yet for 2014. So once they get finished with the meeting, some way, shape, or form, the January 15th deadline, they are free to go. They can get started on writing appropriations bills. And per usual, the goal is to get that done by September 30th. And this year, because 2014, in case you haven't noticed, is evenly divisible by 2, there will be a strong incentive for the Congress to get done as early as possible so that they can, in the words of Governor William J. LePetomane in the movie Blazing Saddles protect their phony baloney jobs.
Joe, we got 5 minutes.
Oh, boy. 5 minutes, and I'm up to page 12. You've got the document there, and what I tried to do is to go through some of the realities with respect to the way the budget works, mandatory spending, discretionary spending, the derivation of the numbers for the public debt, budget authority outlays, et cetera, et cetera. Probably of what you've got there, I mean, certainly I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have. I think you've got contact information, and I'd be happy to talk to you about the issues there. The stuff that is going to be pertinent this year, given where we are, really comes down to appropriations. The point of this year is to, given this agreement, and the reason why this agreement passed is to try to get the numbers done, the appropriations done, and to get them done and smoothly and with minimal fuss so that they can do their election year thing. The president is going to talk about a grand vision for the budget that is probably not going to go anywhere. He did the last 2 years. I would not put very heavy odds on completion of any major structural changes in the budget at this point. So what I would suggest, take the take the document, take a look through it. I would suggest almost everything in this document, almost all of the reference tables that you have there are in what are called the summary tables that are presented at the back of the document that is called the budget. When you're looking for numbers, you will probably find that you will go essentially to two places. One is for numbers going forward. Those summary tables in the budget will be extremely helpful. If you're looking for context going backward, there's a volume of the budget which is called historical tables, which you will also find to be extremely useful. But on the day the budget comes down on you, and you're trying to figure out what to say about what the president has proposed, what's the big picture in terms of what he's trying to do, those summary tables in the back of the budget will be your primary source. And what I tried to do in the document that you've got is to walk you through the summary tables to touch on the numbers that are most important for the time after you get the budget when you're trying to write your initial story. I think that will probably give you a reasonable sense of where you need to go. I can tell you that, apart from the time when I was working on producing the budget, when I was up in the Congress and I was always working for the minority in those years, and the budget was going to come out, and your member had a time in the press gallery, for 1 o'clock to do his presentation on why the budget was such a bad thing, and you got it at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you had until 1 o'clock, so you had 5 hours to explain to him, to the point where he was ready, everything that was in all the major parts of the budget, what the major initiatives were and so forth. It was those summary tables that gave me what I needed to know. So I think that's, to give you the sense that that's probably going to be the most useful source for you.
Thank you so much. That was